Seriously injured in an automobile accident as a young man, Ed Eckhenhoff was forced to change focus from his high school love of athletics to becoming a serious student in college. But first, he needed to learn to walk again, with the help of braces and crutches and dedicated caregivers. He spent 3 months in a rehabilitation hospital as a patient, and most of the rest of his professional life in rehabilitation hospitals as a leader. His career took him from leadership at the renowned Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago to the founding of the National Rehabilitation Hospital in Washington, D.C. In this selection from a longer oral history interview, Ed Eckhenhoff tells how he went about using networks of powerful friends to persuade prominent people in Washington to serve on the founding board of the National Rehabilitation Hospital. He also describes the early challenges of attracting top-flight doctors, nurses, and therapists to the new hospital in D.C. Also included in this oral history interview is a conversation between Ed Eckhenhoff and his successor, John Rockwood, on topics of mentoring and the transition of leadership. And then the accident happened. You've alluded to it a number of times, but would you tell the story of
I will.
that?
It was, I had my first year at Transylvania. It was completed. And I didn't do very well. I had gone to bed, already packed, ready to come back to Philadelphia the following day. My roommate came into the room, woke me up, said, "Oh my Lord, I've left my wallet at the sorority house. Got to go back and get it." There was a party there, I guess. Oh, I didn't go to it, but he said, and I'll never forget this, he said, "Come on, let's get back out to my car." He had this beautiful 1943 TD MG, completely restored. It was a beautiful car. And he said, "Let's go out for a last drive." Well, he meant, of course, last drive before we head home for the summer. And 15 minutes later, he was dead. We went off the side of a road. I was very fortunate to have been thrown out of the car, very fortunate to have been a large, somewhat muscular fella who must have bounced several times on the street. Broke my back, broke my spinal cord, but was very fortunate to have lived.
What was the nature of your care?
Well, remember, this is 1963, and there were a lot of people dying from accidents like that back then. Today, of course, I think I think medicine is far more advanced. Of course, it is, and far more people live. I was very lucky to have lived. I think the care was exceptional. We knew a number of physicians there in Lexington because my father, as I've already stated, went to Transylvania, went to the University of Kentucky, knew a number of the doctors there in Lexington. So, and all I had on that night was a pair of Bermudas and a t-shirt. As I told you, I had gone to bed. And I don't know how this happened, but I was asking for my godfather, who was Dr. Francis Massey, who was a dear friend of my father's, and one who assisted my father immeasurably in getting into the University of Pennsylvania. So Dr. Massey was called, and I had no identification on me. I had no wallet on me. And he said, "There is someone here that's been in a horrible accident that is asking for you." And Dr. Massey came down and he realized in the ED very quickly that it was me. And then called my parents, and my father flew down the very next day.
What role did your father have in your care?
Well, he didn't have any direct role, but he was by my side as direct care was being provided. Then Mother came down, and I think the care was very, very good, and I was very fortunate. When I was stabilized, which I think it was several weeks, they decided to fly me to the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, where my father, of course, was on the faculty, and we lived. And my father was a friend of a fellow by the name of Meade Johnson. Metrical. Remember Meade Johnson? Well, Meade Johnson had a private plane. It was I think it was an old DC-3. And that was one way. There weren't any air ambulances back then. It was one way to get me to Philadelphia. And Meade Johnson, Dad called Meade Johnson, told him of the accident. Meade Johnson said, "Is there anything I can do?" And Dad said, "Well, yes, there is one thing you can do. I think your plane may be the only way my son Eddie can get back to Philadelphia, where we'd like to treat him there." And the plane arrived, and I was on a stretcher, and I was jacked up to the door on a lift, and into the aisle I went, and home I flew.
It must have been excruciating for your parents to have received that phone call. And then, I think particularly for your dad, perhaps, to be a physician and just be so, he must have felt helpless. Did he ever share any feelings with you about?
He never shared feelings, nor did Mother, directly after the accident happened. He did share some feelings with me well after the accident had happened. I knew they must have been going through hell. I knew that. But at the same time, our family was always competitive. I don't know how many times Dad had been knocked down or Mother had been knocked down and gotten back up, but it was something I knew I had to do. And interestingly, I never ever remember one day where my mother or father appeared upset. It was life as usual. And we were going to get through it. And everybody was behind me. My brothers were behind me. They were all athletes. And so it was really quite remarkable. But I'll never forget. Can we go forward 4 years? That was in 1963. Went back to college, only missed one semester. Now it was the summer. I missed the fall semester. And I was back in college in January of that following year. And I started studying. I knew I had to do something now. I had to use my brain instead of my body through athletics. And I'll never forget graduating. Now, I was on the wrong dean's list when I was a freshman. And I graduated on the right dean's list. And I began applying myself and thinking about the future, which I really wasn't doing my first year of college. And my father came into my room one evening after having graduated. And he said, "Son," I'll never forget this, "Son, I just want to tell you how very proud your mother and I are. You've had a tough 4 years. You've been through your accident. You graduated with colors. And we're very, very proud of you." And he went on to say, "I'm not sure, but that your accident was not one of the best things that could have happened to you. For it taught you something your mother and father did not teach you, could not teach you. And that was how to use this, as opposed to how to use this." And he said, "I think someday you're going to understand that." And he was darn right. I understood it almost immediately. And he was right. I mean, it was a hard lesson, don't get me wrong. But it turned me around, and I needed to be turned around. And it, I think, was extremely beneficial in making me use what God had given me and to move forward and to become successful.
You were working at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago at the time the new hospital was built. What was it like to move to the new facility?
We were in an old warehouse, the Rehab Institute of Chicago, and I think it was on Ohio Street, if I remember correctly. And I'll tell you, the Rehab Institute of Chicago had one of the most remarkable board of directors of any institution in this country. And they went out and raised a great deal of money to build this new 18-story building on Superior, overlooking Lake Michigan. Now, I don't know how much that cost, but it must have cost a great deal. And I remember Senator Chuck Percy, a friend to many on our board of directors at RIC, was very assistive in securing some money from the government to assist in building the hospital as well. We had people like Wesley and Sue Dixon, on our board who used to own Cyril. We had the Donnellys, Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly, who owned R.R. Donnelly. I mean, it was a who's who. And that board gave, without question, a great deal of money, and they had little problem in securing the funds to build this new great institution. Well, the day came when we were moving in, and we did have the parade. Patricia Neal, the actress, came in, as did Chuck Percy, as did the governor, as did Mayor Daley, and loads of people, and then pushing patients, loads of people, to walk those 3 blocks. And yep, I was there that day. I was in the parade. I did the walk with my braces and crutches. And I'll never forget, one of my first responsibilities as the assistant to the president at RIC was to label and number hundreds and hundreds of boxes, showing where it was those boxes were going to go, which floor. So my job was nothing more than making sure people knew that this box goes on floor number 12, this box goes on floor number 10, and that was my first job. But yep, I was there that day. And I remember Patricia Neal saying in front of everybody, right at the base of the 18-story building, this hospital we have built as a house for heroes. Phew. Never forget that.
You were instrumental in the development and launch of the new National Rehabilitation Hospital in Washington, D.C. How did you go about finding people to serve on the governing board?
Times have changed. I don't think there's any difference between a specialty hospital and an acute care hospital. A large hospital or a small hospital when it comes to a board and developing a board. The board has to be committed. The board absolutely has to understand why it is they're serving. They have to understand quality care. They have to understand fiduciary responsibility. They have to understand that they're going to part way with some of the money in their wallets when the organization might require it. Board members, if they don't come on board 100% committed to the organization, I don't think they belong there. And you build a board through, well, a number of different ways, but one way is to get those board members that you consider to be exceptionally good. Sit down with them, talk with them. Where are their friends? They associate with like people. How do you get some of them? Their friends that are successful, committed, have had other board positions, understand the board responsibility. How do you get them onto the board? And I think you build a board. I mean, I'll tell you about the way in which I built the board at NRH. You want to hear it? Oh, my Lord. I was at a party when I first got to Washington, D.C., and met a couple of people and was telling them about the hospital that we were in the process of building. The first 2 years I was in Washington, it was all planning. I was trying to get Marion Barry, mayor, and others to agree to providing us a certificate of need. We hadn't even broken ground yet, but I tried to get around the town, city, as best I could, met a number of people, and one thing led to the next, and somebody told me one night, you know, if this hospital's a go, and we had received our certificate of need then, you might wish to talk with Stephen Ailes. He's a great fella. He was the Secretary of the Army, I think under Johnson. He was president of the American Railroad Association, and he was a managing partner of a law firm, a very good law firm in Washington, D.C. called Steptoe Johnson. So I called him up and I went to see him, and we had a great talk, and I told him what we were doing, and I said, you know, I'm at a point now where we've received our certificate of need. We have to build a board, and I'm all about building a board now, and would you consider it? He said, well, he was on the board of the Nature Conservancy. He was doing a lot of different things in the city. But he said, I want you to go to my friend, Vince Burke. Vince Burke was the CEO of Riggs National Bank in Washington, D.C. And if you can convince him that it makes some sense for him to sit on your board, I'll do it. Well, I went to visit Vince Burke. Now, these are some of the greatest Washingtonians ever, and I didn't know all of that quite then. And I talked with Vince, and he said, well, I'll tell you what I'd like you to do. I want you to go to Jim Symington, a great, great congressman from Missouri, an attorney in Washington, D.C., known by everybody on Capitol Hill. And if Jimmy Symington says he'd like to serve. And Stephen says he'll like to serve. They're my friends, I'll serve. Well, I went to see Mr. Symington, Congressman Symington. And we talked, we had a lovely time. I mean, he's one of the greatest human beings I've ever met. And we had a great talk. And another name came up. Went back to Steve and I said, Steve, I think we're getting some people who wish to serve on the board. He said, well, I want you to go see Graham Claytor. Graham Claytor was, when Stephen Ailes was the Secretary of the Army, Graham Claytor was the Secretary of the Navy. Graham Claytor was president of Amtrak. Graham Claytor was a Southern gentleman, the likes of which I've never ever met again. And I went to see Graham Claytor. And Graham said, you mean to tell me that Steve Ailes will say yes to the board if I do? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, if that's the case, and Jimmy Symington? And you got to be kidding. Vince Burke? If they all say yes, I'm on. I went back to Stephen. And I said, Mr. Ailes, we have Vince Burke, Graham Claytor, Jimmy Symington, all having said yes, if you say yes to being the chairman. They didn't say that. I said that. He said, you're kidding, but nevertheless, it worked out. We had one of our first meetings, the five of us, somewhat informally, and they mentioned another friend that they had, John Firestone, and then Tom Parrott, all distinguished Washingtonians. And then we said, oh, in another meeting, we're going to need some women. Irene Poland, wife to Abe Poland, and Irene said yes. John Firestone said yes. Then we went to Ed Mitchell. Ed Mitchell was the CEO of Pepco, the largest utility company in the Washington-Baltimore area. And the list just went on and on and on. But it was such fun building that board as we did. Thank heavens I was steered to Stephen Ailes first. But, oh my Lord, it worked like clockwork.
What's the optimal size of a hospital board?
Age-old question. I do. I think that when you get to be 30, 40, 50, 60 people, way too much. I think when you have 5 or 6 people, probably a little small. I would say an optimum size for a board. Remember now, we have to have various committees on the board. I think a great size for a board would be between 10 and 15 or 16 people.
What would you consider to be the characteristics of a good board chair?
To be totally committed to the CEO and organization, number one. I think a great board chair is someone who is not going to micromanage. I think a great board chair is going to be someone who will depend on his or her CEO and their respective staffs. You do not want the chairman of the board to tell you which color to paint the bathroom adjoining the boardroom. They have to depend on you. If you're not doing your job, you're going to leave. If you're doing your job, you're going to have full support. I've been blessed by having had, over the years I was at NRH, I've been blessed by having had great, great chairmen.
Generally speaking, do hospital board members understand the healthcare field?
I think most of the board members that join hospitals probably don't know a great deal about healthcare when they initially join, unless, of course, they're physicians or somebody that's had a healthcare background. But I think for the majority of them, they might be interested in the hospital and the hospital them because they've given a lot of money. It might be because they've been wonderfully successful in the business world but don't know a great deal about healthcare. Who knows? I think it's up to in our case, the hospital, to have a good board orientation program, to bring them up to date with what a hospital is, how many employees, how many departments, what it is we do, the metrics that we look at on a monthly basis, the need for continuing to establish high-level quality within the programs we provide. I mean, all of this is critically important. So I would say that the average board member, after a year or two sitting on the board of a hospital, knows its industry pretty well. I would say it surely knows the mission because the board is involved in strategy. The board is involved in strategic planning. The board has delegated much of the operations to its chief executive officer and to the chief executive officer staff. But when it comes to strategic planning, where it is we wish to be in 3 years, where it is we wish to be in 5 years, that's board responsibility. I think the board responsibility from a fiduciary role is how well are we doing financially. That's board responsibility. I think it's cut and dry. There are those responsibilities that the board has to be very involved in, and there are responsibilities that the board should not be involved in, but that the chief executive officer and his or her staff should be involved in.
How was the National Rehabilitation Hospital founded?
I was telephoned by a mutual friend of a person who wanted to see what a rehabilitation hospital was all about. He was a real estate developer, Jeffrey Cohen, in Washington, D.C. He had just purchased a parcel of land in Washington, a city block in Washington, D.C. It was the old Children's Hospital site, and he was trying to figure out what to do with it. And did it make sense to build another children's hospital? Well, the answer to that was no. We have one of the great children's hospitals in Washington, D.C. Did it make sense to build a psychiatric hospital, another specialty hospital? Clearly not an acute care hospital. So he did some due diligence, and a mutual friend of ours, Richard Verville, who was an attorney in Washington, D.C., said, well, you ought to go out and speak with Ed Eckhenhoff, who's the administrator at the Rehab Institute of Chicago, one of the best in the country, and to this very day is ranked #1 by everybody. And so Jeffrey Cohen came out, and I showed him the hospital. He was, needless to say, very impressed with RIC. And then brought out 2 other people who were partners of his, Theodore Mariani, an architect, and Samuel C. Jackson, who was Secretary of HUD for a while, and a wonderful human being. And it was those 3 that were trying to figure out what to do with this right of first refusal they had on a city block in Washington, D.C. They then invited me several times to come to Washington, D.C. to look at the site and to give them advice as to whether or not this might make some sense, a rehabilitation hospital. I remember frequently flying out of Chicago Friday night and getting back Sunday night so that I could be at work Monday morning. And I did that for 3, 4, 5 months, every other week. And we got to develop a friendship. I began to believe in what it was they were doing. And we then went for the certificate of need. And we brought on a couple of other consultants. Carol Moore, a wonderful person who assisted us immeasurably. Nicole Jeffers, I remember that name. And we developed a certificate of need. I knew more about incidence, prevalence, how many spinal cord injured within the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area, how many strokes, how many traumatic brain injured people will suffer brain injury any given year. And we went before the Certificate of Need, SHPTA, in the District of Columbia, and finally won a Certificate of Need to build the hospital, having visited the mayor's office, Marion Barry, who just passed away, a number of times. And it was in 1984 that we received the CON. We broke ground and opened our hospital in 1986. I'll never forget it, with 289 staff and 1 patient. And I looked up and wondered, the moon is shining. Is it time to get out of town or what? But a lot transpired between then. This was an effort on behalf of the real estate investors to make some money. Instead, ran out of money. And it was to be a proprietary organization. And a guy by the name of John McDaniel, who I thought a great deal of, was president of the Washington Hospital Center, had just brought in Capitol Hill Hospital and developed a corporate logo by the name of the Washington Healthcare Corporation, came and visited with me and said, you know, instead of building downtown, we'd sure like for you to build out on our 45, 50 acre campus, where the National Children's Hospital is, the Washington Hospital Center is, and the Veterans Administration Hospital. Where better to build a specialty hospital than right there? And we were really, everything was collateralized. I mean, we were out of money. And fortuitously, the investors, I was not one, but the investors agreed that they had to do something. And this was a great offer. And essentially sold the rights to the hospital. And you can't sell a certificate of need, but they sold it so as to pay the debts that they had acquired to the Washington Healthcare Corporation, which was primarily the Washington Hospital Center. And I'll never forget, John said to me, if we're going to go through with this, you're locked in. I'm putting handcuffs on you for 5 years. I want to get this thing up. I want it to work. And so you're sticking around. So I said, fine. We went to New York. We had Morgan fighting Mellon to give us the $50 million. There wasn't any fundraising. I mean, starting an organization and trying to raise money in Washington, D.C. is very difficult. I mean, there's so many different organizations in Washington, D.C. You have the National Children's Hospital Medical Center, you have all the hospitals, you have all the beautiful museums, you have the opera. I mean, you just don't start a new organization and go out and raise money. Very difficult. So we borrowed it. and we went into significant debt to build the institution, and we borrowed enough money to, if I remember, the cost of the building and to equip it back in '84 was essentially $18 to $20 million. That was it. And the remainder of the money was to be used during the first 18 months for operational expenses. And we were very fortunate to have broken even on a going forward basis on the 17th month. So we were an organization that was going to succeed. But we borrowed all of our money in the beginning.
Was there opposition to the building of the National Rehabilitation Hospital?
There was very little competition for rehabilitation. There was a small, ever so small unit at the George Washington University Hospital. Across the river in Virginia, there was a 40 or 50 bed unit, but other than that, there wasn't much rehab unless you went to Baltimore. So from a competitive standpoint, there was not a lot of competition. Oddly enough, I'll never forget, in our last hearing at the Certificate of Need, they asked for public comments after I had presented, and a lady in a wheelchair raised her hand, came up, given the microphone, and she was very much against this. And this was true with a number of people back then, and still to this day, that think that it's far better to put money into research to try and cure spinal cord injury and or traumatic brain injury or whatever disability category we're talking about. And she thought the money that was being spent for the hospital didn't make any sense. And then went on to say that Ed Eckhenhoff does not represent the disabled. He's not disabled. And I'm sitting in my chair saying, oh my Lord, what are people going to think? That my braces are just a show? I mean, I was really sort of floored by this. I'm not disabled. Well, physically I am. And this was her definition of disability. Do you know that Mr. Eckhenhoff lives in Georgetown in a beautiful home? Do you know he has a car? He doesn't have to get onto transport. He doesn't have to get onto the buses and the trains. I mean, her definition of disability was a wheelchair definition, and that of a poor definition, or I just didn't, well, I understand it, but she didn't understand that a hospital like what we were proposing was going to assist her and everybody like her and me down the road. Mm-hmm. She wanted spinal cord injury cure, and that was what was driving her. Well, not only her, but a lot of other people felt, I'm sure, the very same way. So I would say that those that were against the hospital were as many times the disabled as it was anybody else. They wanted money for research. And I learned a great deal then. And thus, I think, one of the very important reasons why we have the research efforts we do today.
We'd like to welcome John Rockwood to the conversation. He succeeded Ed Eckhenhoff as president of the hospital, which is now known as the MedStar National Rehabilitation Network. What was the transition like?
From my perspective, when I think about the transition and succession planning part of this, Ed developed a very unique culture, and he was the only CEO that hospital had ever known and ever seen, and he'd recruited so many of them, and it was it was his culture, and his culture was supported by all those that he recruited around him, and I think one of Ed's remarkable leadership styles is his ability to relate to people and get the best out of people. I mean, he really is, people don't want to fail him. People feel like they're working for a higher purpose, and Ed has the ability really to keep them motivated and keep them engaged. And there was also a bit of a family atmosphere, and I think that has continued somewhat today. But I think from a succession planning perspective, I think Ed and the board, and at the time the corporate leadership had decided that there really wasn't it would really be hard for the organization to have an outside search and for that to be successful in the short term. And I think there's lots of opportunities where that happened, but if we hadn't started, and if Ed hadn't started signaling to the organization very early on, I think it would have been a traumatic time for the hospital.
Absolutely.
And I think from many different respects, the transition between Ed and I was extremely smooth. And I think it was smooth for a couple of reasons. One is Ed's been a terrific mentor. Ed set the transition up for success, and if you don't have that side of it, no transitions will work. So everybody in the organization and the board knew that I had Ed's support, and I think that was really a foundation to a lot of it. But then he also had the ability to step away at a point during the transition and out of operations, and really tried to push different things my way, which is not easy to do when you've spent your life creating an organization and building an organization. And I think the fact that he was still active and involved as he is today, but they see his efforts to push more responsibility and more decisions to me, I think just made that really seamless.
How did you approach mentoring?
Well, first of all, I don't know that much about mentoring. I am not a professor. It came natural. I mean, when you see somebody who shines and does a very good job, what you do is you try and give them more. And you don't micromanage. You do everything you can to develop or assist them in developing their own managerial style. And the more I gave him to do, the more he did magnificently. So yes, that I guess is defined as mentoring, but it sort of came naturally. I mean, we all did that with others who reported to us. I mean, this is what you're supposed to do to all your direct reports. But some were a little bit more susceptible to moving forward than others might have been. And you have to sort of pick and choose there, but his was an easy choice. And then you just spent more time developing the level of expertise, in this case John, as to what I thought I had, and it worked.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that as I've thought about mentoring, kind of on the other side, you know, as I've taken on this new role, the difference that I found between the relationship that Ed and I had was, I mean, a couple things. First is we had a personal relationship, and I don't think in all mentoring relationships that is the most appropriate way to go or the strongest way to go. But if you don't have some personal interest in that individual's ability and willingness to succeed, I think that's a key tenet for a lot of mentoring relationships. There's got to be some connection there.
That's a good point.
That is beyond just the professional relationship. But there also has to be, I think, the ability for you to be transparent and honest and deliver both constructive criticism and reinforcement as well. So Ed always had the ability. I mean, even as I was growing up in the organization at NRH, one of Ed's leadership styles is also you always know where you stand with him. So he's always very positive. If something is not going well, you know it. If something's going well, you know it. There are kind of equal parts positive and negative there. And so it was, that was an important part of my growth, is being able to learn and have the tough conversations as well as have the very positive ones. So, and I think that's important for a mentoring.
Yeah, and you left one word out: trust.
Trust.
There has to be trust. And so long as there's trust, that also assists significantly in making your day a little lighter.
Did you give a lot of thought to the hospital's culture?
No, I thought a great deal about it. I mean, I told you about the name badges. I wanted our first names on there, with the exception of the physicians. But I wanted our first names on there. I wanted everybody to feel a part of the organization. I wanted everybody to think that their job was as important as my job was. I told you about how so many people see patients far more than I do on a daily basis. So they have to understand that they've been empowered to do their thing, and I have literally nothing to do with patients on the patient floors. So we all have our parts to play, and we're all important. And without any of us, something's not going to happen. So I think everybody started understanding that, and I spent a lot of time up on the floors talking to staff and or talking to patients. Now, one of the things that was beneficial to me that John doesn't have, thank God, is my disability. And so I got to see an awful lot of patients that have just become disabled, and so the doctors wanted me to talk with them, which I very much enjoyed doing. And throughout that process, I got to see a lot of staff on the way up to the patient's room, on the way back, while up on the patient room. And I mean, everybody in the hospital, and you would agree with this, everybody in the hospital called me Ed. And that's what I wanted.
Absolutely.
And everybody in the hospital today calls him John. And I just feel very good about that, because we're one of many parts that makes a difference, but we all are needed to carry our institution forward.
I would say the other thing that's really was, and I just hear this from other people talking about Ed, is and I said this earlier, but he really did have the ability to connect people. I think part of it was your psychology background. You had the ability to read people and understand what motivated them, and I think you also led by example. I mean, it's not as easy for you to get around as a lot of other people, but you were always out, always in patient rooms, always up on the floors. He really invested in that culture of teamwork, and in rehab, that's the basis for everything we do. Is if you don't work as a really well-oiled team that has lots of different disciplines that have unique and often equal value to the recovery of the patient, then things break down real quick. And that started at the top. And it started with our executive team. I thought, and I hope that still holds true today, but
I think it does.
There's a level of trust, and there's a level of people certainly working hard, but supporting each other.
Will there be a continued need for the rehabilitation hospital?
There has to be. If there is not, I pity all those who become disabled, because it will come 360 degrees. 50, 75 years ago, people were relegated to the attics and the basements of their homes. They couldn't get out. They weren't independent. They were residing in wheelchairs. Acute rehabilitation, by the way, really initiated by Paul Magnuson in the VA system before he went to RIC. We would have come 360 degrees. If we get rid of acute rehabilitation, who else is going to teach independence? Who is going to acutely rehabilitate or assist others in assisting themselves, to support themselves, to become productive citizens of our country, and to live good lives? Who's going to do it if we're not there? And the statistics are not going down. There are a lot of traumatic brain injured every new year, a lot of spinal cord injured every new year, more spinal cord injured coming now because of cell phones and everybody having their minds elsewhere and not paying attention to what they're doing, and or disability is going to continue as long as we live under a system that contains gravity.